Confession 1: The day I sold a man's memories. I never thought money would push me into doing something I'd be ashamed to think about years later, but that was before the pandemic took away my job stability and my pride with it. Back then I worked for a small moving company, handling old furniture, dusty boxes, and apartments abandoned by people who either moved on with their lives or simply didn't have anyone left. It wasn't glamorous, but I always considered it honest work, and I clung to that belief like it was a shield. I didn't realize how fragile that shield really was. The job that changed everything started like any other. An elderly tenant had passed away, and the landlord needed his apartment cleared quickly so a new renter could move in. No family came to claim his belongings, no friend asked about his things, and no instructions were left behind. Everything inside the apartment was legally unclaimed. To the landlord, it was nothing more than clutter delaying his next paycheck. To us movers, it was just another assignment where we could throw away, donate, or keep whatever seemed useful. None of us expected anything valuable to be inside. I found the wooden box while cleaning the bedroom, hidden in a drawer under the bed as if the man wanted it close to him. It didn't look expensive, no locks, no gold trim, no fancy engravings, just old wood and a metal latch that clicked softly when I opened it. Inside were photo albums, handwritten letters, faded drawings, ticket stubs, and 2 wedding rings resting in a small velvet pouch. Everything was worn out, but it was clear these items meant something. They weren't junk, they were the fragments of someone's life. For a moment, I felt like I was holding a heartbeat. A normal person would have closed the box and reported it to the landlord, but I wasn't in a normal state of mind. Rent was due in 3 days and my bank account looked like a joke. I hadn't bought groceries in a week. Desperation makes the world shrink until morality becomes something distant and blurry. I wish I could tell you I hesitated for a long time, wrestling between right and wrong, but the truth is I made the decision faster than I want to admit. I told myself it didn't matter because the owner was gone, and no one seemed to care about his belongings anyway. I took the rings to a pawn shop after work. The man behind the counter examined them with practiced detachment, as if he'd seen 1,000 stories pass through his hands. He weighed them, checked the engraving, and barely lifted an eyebrow. $250, he said, pushing the money toward me without a hint of curiosity. I took the cash, shoved it into my pocket, and walked out before guilt could fully settle in. The next morning, the landlord stopped by. He asked if we had found a wooden box under the bed because a neighbor mentioned the old man had kept something important inside it. He thought the man might have wanted it to be passed to a distant niece. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe, but I kept my face neutral and shook my head. "Didn't see anything like that," I said, pretending to look confused. The landlord sighed and muttered, "Shame. Some things aren't worth much, but they matter to someone." That sentence echoed inside my mind like a slow-moving blade. I didn't spend the money that day. Or the next. Or the week after. I couldn't bring myself to use it. Every time I opened the envelope, I imagined the old man's hands touching the rings, slipping them onto his wife's finger, celebrating anniversaries, or crying during arguments that later turned into reconciliations. I imagined the niece receiving an empty apartment, wondering why the one box she cared about had vanished. I imagined myself standing in her place, hoping someone would show a little humanity. And then I saw myself again, taking the rings without hesitation. I eventually burned the money in my backyard. Not because it made anything better, but because I couldn't stand to see it anymore. People think the worst things done for money are dramatic crimes, elaborate schemes, or dangerous jobs, but sometimes it's something small and quiet and cruel. Sometimes the worst thing you do is erase someone's memories for a handful of bills you can't even use without feeling sick. To this day, I'll never know whether the niece ever came looking for that box. I guess that's the part that hurts the most. Confession 2: The job I never told my son about. Most people assume the worst things done for money involve crossing legal boundaries, but the really painful ones are the things that crush your dignity in ways words can't fully describe. When my son was 7, he needed surgery. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was expensive and urgent, and the insurance company tossed me around with technicalities and loopholes until I realized I was completely alone. I had no savings, no partner, and no family willing to help. I felt like I was drowning with my son pulling on my sleeve for reassurance I couldn't afford to give. A friend reached out after hearing what I was going through. He told me he knew about a side job that paid well but came with a warning: it's weird. Really weird. But it's legal and it pays in cash. That was all I needed to hear. Desperation silences your pride, and I wasn't in a position to question anything that could get my boy the treatment he needed. I told him yes without asking for details. That's how I ended up wearing a giant blueberry costume at an extravagant birthday party hosted by a billionaire family. The outfit was huge, round, heavy, and ridiculous from every angle. I could barely see through the mesh in the headpiece. The theme was some absurd enchanted fruit kingdom, and I was booked as one of the dancing berries. It sounds funny now, but in the moment, standing inside that mansion with marble floors and chandeliers worth more than my entire apartment building, I felt a type of humiliation I hadn't known before. When I stepped into the garden to begin my performance, parents chuckled quietly and pointed at me. Kids jumped on me like I was a trampoline. A few adults whispered things like, "Imagine being paid to do that," or "That guy must really need the money." They weren't wrong, but hearing it out loud felt like being stabbed with something dull and slow. What made it harder was knowing I had lied to my son earlier by saying I had to work late at my normal job. I couldn't tell him the truth. I didn't want him to see me that way. I danced for hours in that heavy costume. I tripped on purpose to make the kids laugh. I let myself be pushed, grabbed, and treated like a prop. When the party finally ended, the event organizer handed me an envelope with $900 inside. I sat in my car afterward, the costume half off and my shirt soaked in sweat, and I cried. Not because I was ashamed of what I'd done, but because I knew I would have done much worse if that was what it took to give my son a healthy life. My son is an adult now, and he still doesn't know. He thinks I worked overtime that week. He thanks me sometimes for raising him alone, and those moments make me wonder if I should tell him someday. But every time the thought crosses my mind, I stop myself. Not because I'm ashamed, but because I don't want him to think for even a second that his health came at the cost of my dignity. The truth is, I'd lose my dignity 1,000 times if it meant he never had to lose anything. Confession 3: The night I let something happen. I don't talk about this story because even now, years later, I still don't know how to categorize what happened. It wasn't illegal, not exactly, but it wasn't moral either, and it's the kind of thing that keeps resurfacing in your mind when you think you've already buried it. At the time, I was broke, angry, and convinced life owed me something, which is a dangerous combination when you're standing at a crossroads. All I can say is that the person I was back then is someone I hope I never become again. I used to work as a night security guard for an industrial warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place stored high-end electronics, mostly computers and camera systems, the kind of inventory that made insurance companies nervous. My job was simple: walk the perimeter, check the doors, fill out reports, and stay awake. The company trusted us with keys, but they also trusted us to be invisible, guards who guarded nothing except the illusion of safety. That's how it always felt to me. My paycheck barely covered rent and food, and every month I watched numbers disappear from my bank account faster than I could earn them. One night a coworker of mine, a man named Reyes, leaned against the break room counter and told me he had an opportunity if I was interested. He spoke casually, as if offering me a shift trade, but there was something in his voice that made it clear he wasn't talking about overtime. I asked what kind of opportunity he meant, but he didn't explain. He just smiled and said, "You'll know when the time comes." I didn't think much of it until 2 weeks later when I saw headlights approaching the back of the warehouse during my shift. No one was scheduled for deliveries at that hour, and the truck that pulled up wasn't company branded. My hand instinctively moved toward my radio, but something stopped me. I recognized Reyes climbing out of the passenger seat. He didn't look nervous, just focused, like someone who had done this before. He saw me watching from the loading dock and raised his hand in a calm, slow wave. He walked toward me as the truck doors opened, revealing two men inside handling crates like they owned them. Reyes spoke in a low voice and said they were relocating inventory, and all he needed from me was silence. He didn't ask me to help. He didn't ask me to turn off cameras or disable alarms. All he needed was for me to pretend I wasn't seeing what I was seeing. I told him I couldn't do that, but he shrugged and said, "You don't have to do anything. Just walk away for 30 minutes. I knew what was happening. They were stealing from the warehouse. Not petty theft. Not a single item tucked into a jacket. This was a coordinated operation. The crates carried thousands of dollars worth of electronics. Maybe tens of thousands. And all I had to do was not interfere. That was it. Just look the other way and pretend nothing unusual was happening. I should have radioed the supervisor. I should have contacted the police. I should have done anything except stand there frozen. Instead, Reyes reached into his jacket, pulled out an envelope, and placed it into my hand. He didn't force it on me. He didn't threaten me. He just slid it into my palm and said, "For your time." Then he walked past me as if everything was already decided. I didn't open the envelope right away. I didn't want to know how much was inside, because knowing meant acknowledging what I was agreeing to. But curiosity is powerful, and fear is even stronger. When I finally opened it, I found neatly folded bills, far more money than my paycheck. Enough to cover 2 months' rent. Maybe more. Enough to erase the financial pressure that had been suffocating me. I didn't say yes. But I also didn't say no. And silence, in that moment, was the most expensive answer I could have given. I walked toward the side entrance, pretending to do a routine check. My footsteps sounded heavier than usual, almost accusing. For 30 minutes, I looked at my phone, stared at the empty hallways, and tried to convince myself that what was happening outside wasn't my responsibility. All the while, the truck was being loaded with stolen inventory, and I let it happen. When the truck finally drove away, the parking lot felt too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. I thought the guilt would hit me immediately, but it didn't. Not at first. What I felt instead was relief, a dull, tired, desperate relief that the money in my pocket meant I wouldn't have to choose between rent and groceries that month. That relief only lasted a few hours. The next morning, the warehouse manager called an emergency meeting. Someone had noticed the missing crates during inventory review, and panic spread through the staff like wildfire. The police were notified. Investigations began. My stomach twisted every time an officer walked past me. They asked if I had seen anything suspicious on my shift. The question was so direct, so casually delivered, that my mind went blank. I wanted to tell the truth, but fear wrapped around my throat and squeezed. I shook my head and said no. The officer nodded, jotting something down in his notebook, and moved on. That moment still replays in my mind sometimes, the way my voice sounded too calm, too rehearsed. I didn't realize how dangerous a lie becomes once it leaves your mouth. Weeks passed, and no one was arrested. The company installed more cameras. Reyes quit without warning, leaving me without closure or explanation. I kept the envelope hidden under my mattress, untouched. I couldn't spend it. Every time I tried, my hand refused to move. The money felt cursed, not literally, but morally. It was the weight of knowing I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. What made everything worse was when the warehouse eventually discovered that the insurance didn't fully cover the loss. They had to cut staff hours and freeze raises. Some employees were let go. I wasn't one of them, but watching people pack their desks because of something I had allowed to happen was a different kind of punishment. They had no idea why the company struggled that quarter. They didn't know I had played a part in it. But I knew, and that was enough to twist my stomach every time I walked through the warehouse doors. I wish I could say I returned the money. I didn't. I wish I could say I confessed. I didn't do that either. The envelope stayed hidden for a long time until one day I threw it into a river, watching the bills scatter in the water until they sank. It didn't make me feel better. It didn't undo anything. It just removed the physical reminder of my worst decision, leaving only the memory behind. People imagine the worst thing done for money looks like greed. But sometimes it looks like fear. Sometimes it looks like a moment of weakness that spirals into consequences you never intended. And sometimes it looks like standing still while something terrible happens in front of you, doing nothing to stop it. That was my moment. And I still think about it more often than I'd like to admit. Confession 4, the day I took advantage of a friend. There's a particular kind of shame that comes from betraying someone who trusted you, and it lingers in a way money never can. I had a friend once, someone who believed I was a good person even when I wasn't sure of that myself. He wasn't rich, not by any stretch, but he was generous in the ways that mattered, and sometimes that's all it takes for someone desperate to make a terrible decision. I've spent years wishing I could go back and choose differently. His name was Darren. He worked part-time at a car wash and part-time at a community center, splitting his days between cleaning windshields and supervising kids who needed direction. He never complained about how little he earned, even though he lived paycheck to paycheck just like I did. Somehow he made life look easier than it actually was, and I admired that. Maybe that's why the guilt afterward felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried. One night, Darren invited me to help him clean out a storage unit he'd inherited from an uncle. He said his uncle collected old electronics and random odds and ends but never bothered to sort them. I didn't think much of it, but I agreed to help because I needed the cash he offered. When we opened the unit, we found exactly what he'd described: dusty boxes, tangled cables, half-working gadgets, and crates filled with parts that looked too old to be useful. As we sorted, I noticed a small metal safe tucked behind a stack of battered stereo components. It was scratched and dented, and the dial on the front was slightly rusted. I asked Darren if he knew what was inside, and he shook his head casually. "Probably just old paperwork," he said, pushing it aside. But there was something about its weight, something about the way it clinked softly when shifted, that made my heart beat differently. We loaded everything into his truck and drove it back to his house. He planned to sort the haul the next morning, so we carried the boxes into his garage and locked up the storage unit before leaving. When we were done, he handed me $50 and thanked me for helping. I nodded, pretending I wasn't thinking about the safe, pretending I wasn't calculating things I shouldn't have been calculating. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, imagining what could be inside the safe: money, jewelry, maybe something worth more than either of us earned in a month. The next day, Darren called to say he had to work an extra shift at the car wash and wouldn't have time to start sorting. He gave me the code to his garage so I could drop off a few items I still had in my trunk from the night before. That was when the temptation became too strong. My chest tightened with a mix of anticipation and dread. I told myself I wouldn't do anything except look, just look, but that was the first lie of many. I drove to his house, entered the garage, and stared at the safe for a long moment as if it were staring back. I had seen enough movies to know how to break into a cheap safe. A hammer, a screwdriver, and enough force applied at the right angle could crack it open. It wasn't complicated. The only complicated part was living with myself afterward. When the safe finally snapped open, the sound echoed through the garage in a way that made me freeze. Inside was a velvet pouch, a stack of envelopes wrapped in rubber bands, and a set of old coins sealed in plastic. I opened one envelope and found cash, not a fortune, but far more than either of us had expected. The coins looked valuable too, old enough to be worth something to a collector. That was the moment everything inside me split into two voices. The first insisting I put everything back and walk away, and the second reminding me how broke I was, how exhausted I felt, how hollow my stomach had been for the last week. I took the cash. Not all of it, but enough that I lied to myself by calling it not that bad. I closed the safe as best I could, wiped the tools, and drove home with the envelope stuffed into my jacket. My hands were shaking the entire drive. I told myself Darren wouldn't notice. I told myself it didn't make me a bad person. But both of those thoughts were temporary comforts that dissolved quickly. 2 days later, Darren called. He said he finally had time to sort through the items and wanted me to come over. My stomach dropped. When I arrived, he showed me the safe, now partially broken with the latch bent inward. He looked confused, not angry, just concerned. "I swear I didn't break it," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "It must have happened when we moved it." I nodded quickly, too quickly, agreeing with him before he even finished speaking. Then he told me what was inside. The coins were part of a small collection his uncle had started for him as a child. The cash came from an old savings envelope his uncle had set aside in case Darren ever needed help. He talked about it with a soft smile, completely unaware that I had stolen from him. Every word twisted deeper into my conscience like a slow-turning knife. I wanted to confess. I wanted to apologize. I wanted to give back what I had taken. But I didn't do any of those things. I told him the safe must have rusted through. He believed me without hesitation. As the months passed, our friendship stayed intact on the surface, but I couldn't look at him the same way. Every time I saw his smile, I felt smaller. Every time he said something kind, I remembered how little kindness I had shown him in return. Our paths eventually drifted apart. Life got busy. Phone calls became rare. And somewhere along the way, our friendship faded into nothing more than a memory. Sometimes I think about reaching out to him, but I don't know what I would say. "I'm sorry" feels too small. Returning the money would feel too late. And forgiveness, if it even exists for something like this, feels like something I don't deserve. People imagine the worst thing done for money is something dramatic or violent, but sometimes it's simply choosing selfishness over loyalty. And that choice has a way of lasting longer than any dollar ever could. Money has a strange way of revealing the parts of ourselves we don't want to believe exist. It turns fear into impulse, desperation into justification, and regret into something we learn to carry quietly. These stories aren't about villains or heroes, they're about people who faced moments of weakness and made decisions they can't take back. Maybe that's why confessions like these stick with us. They remind us how fragile morality can be when survival feels like the priority.